Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Thank you for being with us on time. We are about to start. We just wanted to test the sound of the special rapporteur to make sure we can run this event. Yes, very good.
Great.
Good morning. Thank you for being very early where you are now.
Thank you.
So if it's fine with everybody, we can now start the event. Are you okay? I'm turning to Yves Lador. Okay, let's start. Even though people are still joining, let me now officially launch this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx, to who is now joining us on Facebook Live, and to who will be watching later this video. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a side event to the fourth session of the meeting of the parties to the Protocol on Pollutant Release and Transfer Registers of the Aarhus Convention. This event is co-organized by Earth Justice, the Geneva Environment Network, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. The panel will discuss what are the challenges one can face in his or her environment in terms of toxic or hazardous substances, and how can the pollutant release and transfer registers be an instrument for the right to know and the right to science. We will introduce the leading experts we have invited today as they speak. We are honored to welcome today the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the impact on human rights of hazardous substances and wastes, Marcos Orellana. The Special Rapporteur has presented an important report to the Human Rights Council last month on the right to science. So let us now turn to the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Orellana. Dear Marcos, why the right to science and what does it mean? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you very much to the organizers of this panel. As you mentioned, Diana, in the last session of the Human Rights Council that just concluded a few days ago, I had the opportunity to present my report focused on the right to science to the Council. The reason for elaborating a report on the right to science, there are two interrelated challenges. One is the triple crisis of environment in the environmental field of pollution, climate change, biodiversity loss, and what I see in the field is a lack of alignment between the governmental measures that should be addressing this crisis and the actual measures that are being implemented at the national and international level. That's one very big challenge. And the second one is attacks against science. This is disinformation for profit or ideology. It has become quite a lucrative business to disseminate false information. There are firms that specialize on this around the world with what I've termed our mercenary scientists for hire to seed, to obfuscate, to seed uncertainty, to confuse society with the purpose of delaying controls or diverting attention. These are tactics of disinformation, and often those tactics include attacks against scientists themselves. So against this background, the Human Rights Council in the most recent resolution renewing the Toxics and Human Rights Mandate back in 2020 put an emphasis on the science policy interface as a key element in making sure that the right to science is actually effected. It becomes a reality in the lives of people that have the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. Against this background, the right to science has been, I would say, largely ignored by the human rights community for many years. Only recently, in 2020, the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights produced a general comment on Article 15 of that covenant, the covenant that it supervises, which comprehensively addresses the right to science in context, and that provides a solid basis to explore the implications of the right to science in the toxics context. So if I could say a few words about the anatomy of the report. First of all, it describes the scientific process. What is scientific evidence? It provides an overview of the right to science in international human rights instruments. It then identifies the threats against science and scientists. It addresses what kind of mechanisms are available for science to inform toxics policy. And equally important, perhaps, is to mention what it does not address. It does not get into questions of intellectual property rights, or it does not get into questions of how the scientific research or its applications can themselves violate human rights. So with that, let me turn to a couple salient points of the report. First of all, on science. The report makes the point that science is a specific and specialized body of knowledge, knowledge accumulated through an iterative, logical, empirically based process. But an important point there is that it coexists with other forms of knowledge, and the knowledge that indigenous peoples have acquired over centuries, if not millennia, about their local environment. The knowledge that local communities may have about their daily experiences in interaction with toxics. So this leads, this point about coexistence of science with other forms of knowledge leads to at least two corollaries or two implications. One is the participation of the public in the process of scientific research, and that's what the report calls citizen science. It talks about various examples where, under the direction of scientists that define the protocols in order for the information and involvement to be useful, communities have engaged the process of scientific research. And that's one implication, one angle. And another is that by so participating, communities further amplify their agency in the issues that they're particularly concerned about. So, for example, projects carried out in Southeast Asia on pesticide exposure, those projects have increased the agency of communities to be the advocates for themselves in regards to the impacts of those pesticides in their communities and environment. A second implication is the participation in decision making. So in that regard, one fundamental point that needs to be underscored is that the right to science involves an open participation, a participatory decision-making process where the rights of access to information, participation of the public need to be established and protected and implemented. So in terms of normative obligations, a word I need to say about the enabling environment that's required by the right to science. So this involves issues such as the freedom of scientists to determine topics of research. Now, in that regard, the need for scientific research to engage issues of particular social need. It is often the case that science does not serve necessarily issues of public interest, but issues of concern to small segments of the population that have the purchasing capacity of intervening in the market in regards to the technologies and products that are then derived from science. So this is a broad public point about the need for scientific research to address questions of public concern. And in the toxic sphere, we can talk about exposure, among other many issues. A second element of an enabling environment as a normative issue in the right to science is the freedom of scientists to act from undue pressure, and certainly another freedom of expression and information. So the ability to engage in peer review, to share information, to communicate with peers, and also to inform society, to alert about, to warn about the dangers associated with certain processes or with certain products. These are some elements of the right to science as elaborated in the report. And the right can be found in various international instruments, starting from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. I mentioned the ESCR Covenant, Economic, Social, Cultural Rights Covenant, at the global level, but then also at the regional level. The Americas, in the Americas, there's perhaps the most elaborated formulation of the right to science in any regional system. The Arab system also has quite an elaborate formulation. In Europe, the right to science is not explicitly recognized as such, but that said, the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights speaks to scientific evidence in cases involving the right to life, the right to family life, and other environmental related human rights cases. And the African Commission jurisprudence, for example, it also speaks to the importance of independent monitoring, access to independent scientific evidence for communities to be able to participate in decision-making regarding projects that may impact their lives. So even where the right to science is not explicitly addressed in international human rights instruments, the bodies that are tasked with overseeing basic human rights instruments have incorporated scientific evidence into their analysis when it comes to the environment and also in the specifics of the toxics content. So a further word about normative content. One key point is the use of science to inform policy. Now, this may sound even obvious, and in the interactive dialogue that I had at the Council, there were many states that took the floor and reiterated this point. But unfortunately, in practice, policy is not in every instance designed with the benefit of the best available scientific evidence. There's a misalignment here, and that misalignment is not, it is not an accident. It is the result of disinformation campaigns, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, in unpacking this normative content and the use of science to inform policy, the right as formulated in the covenant is for people to benefit from the from scientific advances. So what is the benefit of science? And this is where the general comment of the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights makes a very important point, that it is the production of scientific knowledge. So how does scientific knowledge then benefit society? And that's where the translation of the knowledge into actual policies makes a whole difference. Now, in order for that to take place, that translation process, the availability and accessibility of scientific information to society, but also to specialized circles such as fields of knowledge that I've been talking about, or scientists themselves, they are critical. Now, that would enable governments to take measures and align policies with the best available scientific evidence. One point that that is underscored in the report is about the precautionary principle, because when in this process of translation and in regards to the character of scientific information, it has at sometimes been put forward that the precautionary principle is a tool against science and against scientists, because it enables, so the argument sometimes goes, decision making in disregard of science. And the report is very strong and clear against this argument, because the precautionary principle takes account of the character of science as an iterative process where science does not offer solution, does not offer evidence on all issues at all times in every situation. It is a process of incremental knowledge building where questions are made and then the science is interrogated by other scientists, and so our knowledge continues. And so where that science and scientific evidence reveals evidence, that reveals evidence of possible risks to society, and in this context, in relation to toxics, that evidence is the basis for the precautionary principle, where the evidence is not yet able to draw definitive causal connections between substances and impacts, or processes and impacts. So in that regard, the precautionary principle is based on science. It's based on the right to science. It's an inherent part of the right to science. And it can be seen as an element of due diligence. This is a point that has been underscored by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the element of due diligence in acting with prudence and caution, and operating under the precautionary principle when scientific evidence is not yet able to draw conclusive connections on causation. So that's a point about the precautionary principle. I mentioned earlier about support for research that derives public benefits. And one other point that I wish to make on the normative content is on science policy interface platforms, because that's an area where this process of translation of the scientific evidence into actual policy can take place. In the toxics field, there are several multilateral environmental agreements that are defined to deal with a specific subject matter, whether it's persistent organic pollutants, or the transboundary movements of wastes, or international trade in industrial chemicals, or pesticides. And so the terms of reference, the scope is limited in each of those MEAs. Each of those MEAs, there are others, they have an SPI platform, science policy interface, that will service the MEA, and it plays a key role in the development of the MEA. But there's so far in the international community no comprehensive SPI that can look at the global scope of issues that come around in regards to chemicals and waste, that can scan the horizon, that can provide authoritative assessment, increase awareness, and that piece is lacking. We see it in the climate space with Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. We see it in the biodiversity space, but we do not see it yet in the chemicals and waste cluster. And it's a significant gap, I would argue, because one of the elements of normative content is international cooperation. And international cooperation is critical because science and scientific enterprise is a process and project that takes a lot of resources. And there are many countries in the world, as we know, that lack those resources for conducting their own original science. And they would benefit from the scientific evidence and the science policy interface at the global level established in the toxics field. A couple other reflections before concluding on the threats against science and against scientists. As I mentioned earlier, the misalignment between actual policy and the scientific evidence is, for the most, not an accident. It is the result of deliberate tactics and campaigns by firms that specialize in seeding uncertainty and confusion in society, in seeding ignorance, because ignorance favors the status quo, and the status quo favors those, say, irresponsible businesses that are making a profit out of poisoning people in the toxic sphere. Tactics to divert attention, to delay regulation. Greenwashing is well known, woke washing, blaming the poor while still perpetuating policies that harm them. A couple other things. Disinformation, the tactics that were adopted by the tobacco industry in the 1950s. So putting an emphasis on alternative explanations, it's something else, or claiming lack of proof and demanding ever-increasing amounts of research so paralysis by analysis, and funding front groups, groups that appear legitimate advocacy organizations, but are actually front groups for pushing the talking points of the industry in question. These tactics of the 1950s have been applied in virtually every field of the chemicals and toxics cluster. And this is, of course, a direct attack against the right to science. If that were problematic enough, attacks against scientists are also very problematic. When scientists are silenced, science is silenced. And there's also another threat that I think merits very careful attention, especially as the debates to establish a global platform for a science policy interface are underway, which are conflicts of interest. So if inappropriate financial relations between scientists and decision makers. The approach to dealing with conflicts of interest in many instances rests on management, the argument that there are scientists that are associated or related to industry that should have a role in the science policy interface because of the expertise and knowledge that they bring. That approach is not the approach that has been taken by the IPCC, for example, which has an approach that rests on avoiding conflicts of interest altogether, to preserve the integrity of the scientific information and assessments, and also to protect the IPCC as an institution, to protect the scientists themselves, and to enhance public trust in the scientific assessments that the IPCC carries out. So avoidance of conflict of interest is a very important point that needs to be kept in mind in the design of any global platform on science policy interface. Given the time, I will very swiftly conclude to point out that the right to science requires governments to align their policies with the best available science, and in doing so, science policy interface platforms are the key to transforming knowledge into policy. Thank you for your attention. Good morning, good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Special Rapporteur, for providing your detailed insights and insisting on the importance of the right to science and the accessibility to scientific evidence. Next week, after the 7th meeting of the parties to the Aarhus Convention, the 4th meeting of the parties to the protocol on PRTR will take place. It is now my pleasure to turn to Yves Lador, the representative of Earth Justice to the United Nations in Geneva, and ask, what does this PRTR acronym mean? Indeed, I didn't mention the acronym in my introduction, but when we refer to this protocol, we really use the acronym PRTR. Why do these events happen back to back next week? What do you think as co-organizer of this event? Do you think that the right to science and the meeting next week are linked? So this is what I'm asking you, and I'm turning left because Yves is sitting here in the same room where I am on my left. With that, over to you, Yves.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for your questions. Is the sound okay? So we're okay dealing with these technical issues. So yes, well, indeed, I mean, we have two events which are coming together in a very short timing, which is the report that was presented a few weeks ago by the special rapporteur and which we heard just right now, and the meeting of the parties, the 4th meeting of the parties on the protocol on PRTR next week. And it's not only an issue of timing, but there's also substantial connections between these two questions. And I think what we just heard from the special rapporteur about the fact that the scientific knowledge is developed also along the side of other type of knowledge, that you have also public participation to the production of this knowledge, And that's and for that, it's very important that you have public participation and access to information and so on. Well, these are precisely rights which are defined by the Aarhus Convention, the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters, which is actually the parent or the umbrella convention to the protocol on PRTR. So the PRTR, and I'm going to describe a bit this tool in more detail. This PRTR precisely is an instrument as on the right to know. It's a tool in order to implement this right. And that's why it's totally connected to the discussion that we are having right now. So let me turn to this instrument and give you this explanation a bit with more details. So it's a rather recent instrument that was adopted in Kiev, but that entered into force in 2009. And the PRTR are pollutant release and transfer registered, which means they are an inventory that you do at the national level of the different type of pollution or toxic material which industrial sites or other type of sources are using, are transferring, are keeping in their own stocks. So the objective of this is precisely to have public access to this information so that we can know what is in our environment. We must never forget, and this is too often done, that we do not have a direct knowledge of our environment. We cannot spontaneously know what is the quality of the air we breathe. It's not because we don't smell anything horrible that it means it is totally harmful. Same thing for the water we drink, same thing for the what we eat. So we need some analysis, we need some technical knowledge about what is the environment we are living in. We cannot take it for granted that it is absolutely healthy. And this type of situation, of course, is something new because it totally relates. When I say new, I mean it relates to the industrial age, because we have transformed our environment to such a degree that it is absolutely important to have a technical knowledge about what is surrounding us. So in the next slide, there's a point which we have to have in mind very clearly, because there are sometimes some confusions about the PRTR. The PRTR is not an instrument that regulates pollution. It only regulates the information on pollution. And what is really very important on that is, for example, when we talk with authorities who are dealing, let's say, fire departments or health departments, it is more important to know what is in the atmosphere, what are in the stocks, what are in the buildings, than to know if people are following correctly the rules. The reason is, if you do have a toxic product in one place, it's important to know that. Now that information or that stock might be illegal, but if ever nobody knows about it, then you really have an issue. Because you cannot protect the people, or for example, if you have an interventions of the fire departments, they might be put at risk. So, of course, the very first thing we want is to make sure that everybody applies to and follows the law and does correct protection of the environment. But we know that the situation is not always fully implemented. So how do we deal with that? And so it is very important to make sure that we do have correct information about what is in our environment. And public authorities need to know that in different ways. So the quality of the information we have about about environment is absolutely crucial and must not be directly related or connected to enforcement. Enforcement, of course, is absolutely crucial. We're not saying that it's not the issue, but the fact of having the two tracks helps to have actually the enforcement. And for example, if we just to be very practical, we know that in practice, when fire departments are doing inquiries or they go on site to see what's happening, then of course they push people to enforce it. But they will say, we're not the enforcement authority. We want to know what is there, because in case we have to come in because there's a fire, we want to know whether the building will explode or not. But then of course they push for enforcement because they want these toxic things to be to get rid of as quickly as possible. So we see that it's extremely important to have a clear process and to distinguish the process of the information management and directly the enforcement. Both are connected, but it's important that they are disconnected. And we see that in many, many other fields. It's not only for the pollutants. Just think about what happens in the field of health. It is important that information has a free flow and that we can know what's around us. And then afterwards, we deal about the question of enforcement. So it is an instrument to help I would say, the pressure on the question of the levels of pollution, but it is a specific track of information. So yes, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So of course, it also has an effect that companies usually do not want to be identified as being among the biggest polluters. So this also is an element. Now these we can go to the next slide. This instruments is basically based on the information which is provided by those who are dealing with the source. That is the very first element. And so the states have to collect this information and then to make the instruments publicly accessible and user-friendly. This is something which is extremely important because, of course, we know, and that's also why the PRTRs have been developed, we know that you do have experts in many administration who have a very good knowledge and could do a huge listing of different toxic substances. But for the laypersons like us, this is totally not understandable. So the information is there, but we can't do anything about it. So it's very important that we can have access to this type of information. So the PRTR, one of its objectives is not only to collect the information, but to make it user-friendly. And we can see on the next slide that the PRTR usually lists a number of pollutants. The protocol identified 86 pollutants that have to be registered. A number of countries have more. And for example, also some countries are using it also now in the field of climate change, because then we can ask sources about their CO2 emissions, which are of course different type of category as highly toxic pollutants, but nevertheless are very important for the management of the environment. So, and then you have two types of sources, which are very important because you have the major or the concentrations, the concentrated point of emissions or of sources. And then, as we see on the next slide, you have also the more diffused ones. And these are two types of information. And of course, the activities around there are different, and the way you evaluate their impact is also very different. But it's extremely important to have both of these type of sources. And of course, to allow public participation in the way these instruments are being developed. And on the next slide, we see that it is something that needs to be absolutely mandatory. I mean, there are procedural aspects so that we can, these instruments are absolutely relevant for the information we need. So it has to be mandatory, it has to be annual, it has to cover what is called the multimedia, but that's, I didn't put it like this in the slide, because when laypersons like me read multimedia, you think about the media, the press, and so on. That's in the protocol. The word does not cover this at all. It means what is transporting the pollutant. So the air can be transporting the pollutant, water can be transporting, so they are mediums, or media in the plural. They are media that can bring this to different places. So that's what we mean by multimedia in the protocol. And then it has to be specific on the sites, on the places, and on the different substances. And in the next slide, I wanted to show you a very concrete example. If we take the Swiss register, we are sitting right now, for us managing this event, we are sitting at the International Environment House. Well, the closest site, which has some toxics and that could perhaps be a danger, is the management, the central part of Geneva's public industrial services. And you can see the white dot, which is not far away from the place where we are sitting. And so this is exactly, and you have other dots. You don't see them very well, but on the other side of the river, you have a few other dots. So you can go on each of these dots, then you see what is the site, And then you can click on the different links to see what are the emissions, what are the pollutants they have. So this is the type of user-friendly and geolocalized information that we are supposed to be having for our environment from the PRTR. This is directly from the Swiss PRTR instrument. And so I want to thank you for the attention, for this description, but I think we see very well how this instrument is a tool for our knowledge about our environment. And of course, that is really something directly related to the question of the right to science. It's one of the instruments. It's not, of course, it's far from being the only one, but at least it's a step for us to enter into the knowledge about our environment. And therefore, they are absolutely a critical tool. And unfortunately, they're not used enough. They're not known enough. But as we can see with the previous image, they are rather easy to use, and they are supposed to be friendly for the users. So thank you very much. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, Yves. So pollutant release and transfer registers only regulate information on pollution and deal with quite a number of chemical and hazardous substances. And here in Geneva, we have, we can say it's the headquarters of various it's the UN Chemicals Cluster of the UN is here in Geneva. And we have the presence of various multilateral environmental agreements. And we have the chance to have with us today Amélie Taoufik, who is a legal officer and also the focal point for human rights related issues for the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Conventions. And now I'm turning to her to ask Amélie, how does the Secretariat of the legally binding instruments you present view a tool such as PRTRs? And how do you see a human rights-based approach to these issues, including the right to science? Over to you, Amélie.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those who are not in the same time zone. It's a pleasure to talk about these issues now, especially after the breakthrough by the Human Rights Council last Friday on the global recognition of the new human rights to a clean, healthy, and safe and sustainable environment. For sure, the BRS conventions on hazardous chemicals and waste are linked to human rights, taking their common objectives to protect human health and the environment against the harmful effects of hazardous chemicals and waste. And regarding more specifically the topic where we are talking about today, the PRTRs, well, it's an acronym which we don't use much under the BRS conventions, yet it is linked, and it would greatly help the work and the implementation of the Basel Conventions. And connecting the dots, and for me as a lawyer and also let's say internationalists, the linkages between these very scientific, legally binding treaties and human rights are obvious from these objectives, and I think that PRTRs would be an important tools, and BRS have been using it without naming it, because although they are global tools, they need national implementation, they need national arms to be effective and to be implemented. And this would greatly help, these tools, PRTRs, would greatly help these national implementations of these global treaties. Regarding the human rights-based approach, if you look at the framework, basically what human rights are supposed to do is to protect, respect, and remedy or fulfill. And with these tools, as I mentioned, which would greatly help improving the effectiveness of the implementation of the BRS conventions, that would really help our parties to facilitate such implementation. To remind some of the mechanisms on which these conventions are based. For example, you have the Basel Convention and the Rotterdam Convention, which are centered on a very specific procedure, which is called the prior informed consent procedure, which is very much based on information. parties consent or not to the transitory movements of the listed chemicals and waste under this convention on the basis of information. And this is one of the mechanisms that would greatly benefit from the tools we're talking about today, PRTRs. Also, referring to what Yves and also Marcos were saying about science-based policy decisions and the right to know and the right to science. Under the BRS conventions, you have very specific listing processes of chemicals and waste under the annexes of each of the convention, respectively, and this process is and has to be based on science. There have to be decisions, and you have specific committees, specific subsidiary bodies under the convention, the Chemical Review Committee, the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee under the Stockholm Convention, and CRC under the Rotterdam Convention, which regularly meet, and they have to make recommendations on the basis of sound science. And we have, since a few years ago, a framework under the Basel Convention called From Science to Action, which on the basis of this information, scientific information, feeds the intergovernmental process, which is per chemicals listing or the discussion under each of these subsidiary bodies, technical and scientific. They recommend, and governing bodies of the BRS conventions then take the decisions to list these chemicals or waste on the basis of sound scientific information. So these tools, the PRTRs, would really benefit this work and this process of listing. Of course, these conventions are party-driven, so it's intergovernmental. It's legally binding. The treaties are legally binding, and parties are the driving force of these conventions on the basis of such informations. And if each under each national jurisdiction, each party had complete PRTRs, this would greatly feed and help the process, the different mechanisms and processes and procedures under the BRS conventions. There are other types of obligations under the treaties, also revolving around information. Parties have the obligation to report on the implementation of the listed chemicals and waste. There are also, for example, under the Stockholm Convention, the obligation to submit a national implementation plans to the Secretariat, also based on information, and the quality of reporting would really improve if based on complete and well-fed PRTRs. To conclude, as I see the time, and also to pass on the floor to the following speaker, these tools, these global arms, also there's a caveat to highlight, because they are intergovernmental. Decisions are taken in principle by consensus. It may take sometimes a long time to have certain other listed annexes. Therefore, the coverage of hazardous chemicals is still very limited compared to the reality, and these conventions would not be effective without, and it's the third pillar of a human rights-based approach, to remedy, to fulfill, to respect, without efficient compliance mechanisms, enforcement mechanisms at the level of the parties, but at the national levels. This is why also the process under this intergovernmental processes that are the BRS conventions, partnerships with different stakeholders. We have, and I've mentioned it on several occasions, to have a 360-degree vision partnerships with all stakeholders, including the public, the civil society is key. And what is at the heart of action is information and proper science, and embodied in the conventions, or these tools that would help greatly the work of the convention and of the parties responsible for their implementation, to the PRTRs. So indeed, among our partners, we have entities from the private sector, entities from the civil society who greatly contribute to the work and the implementation as observers of the BRS Convention, including at intergovernmental meetings. Next one being in June 22. Well, actually, it's the second segment of the one that of the meetings that that had their first segment this year. So even if the BRS conventions do not have, whether under, and I'm a legal officer, so the text and the words are very important, they're not mentioned in the provisions of the conventions, and in practice, in the work of implementing the conventions, we don't use it that much. It's without saying that this would be excellent tools to help improving the effectiveness and the implementation of this convention. Thank you very much. And please, if you have any question, whether now or even later, happy to respond, and feel free to contact me and my colleagues at the Secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amélie. Let's now go to on the ground how it works. The European Union is where those PRTRs are in place at the regional level as well as the national levels. The European Environmental Bureau is probably the place where one can have the best view on these issues with so many levels of action. We have the pleasure to have with us today Christian Schäble. I hope I have pronounced your name correctly, who is a policy manager for industrial production at the European Environmental Bureau. So I'm now turning to him, and let's hear from you, dear Christian. What are your reactions and comments on all what you have heard in the previous interventions?
Thanks. Greetings from Toulouse. Thanks very much to the Geneva Environment Network and Earth Justice for inviting me. Well, I can just bring a humble viewpoints in relation to the question around what the PRTRs could do in terms of right to know and right to science in relation to toxic and hazardous substances. And well, I just bring my EU perspective, and from the background, I'm working more on industrial facilities. So I don't want to pretend to have an exhaustive view on the different aspects connected to chemicals policy. But one point, and thanks, Eve, for having presented the PRTR, I think one very important point from our perspective is the key aim of the PRTR is just one of the many tools to actually help preventing and reducing pollution at the sources. That's the end goal. And it should facilitate public participation in the environmental decision making. And of course, the very basic for that is that we understand what is going on and can track progress and performance. And I here would insist for all the stakeholders. So industry, but also the decision makers. How are they delivering in the policy to reduce impacts? And I think this is also part of the recitals of the protocol, where it's also for the governance to track trends, demonstrate progress on pollution reduction, and to set priorities to evaluate progress to achieve the environmental policies and other programs or objectives we have set. So this is, I think, a very important starting point to what should be the function of the PRTRs. Then what I would like to stress in terms of chemical exposure, well, this has been said by others also, there's a very limited scope for the moment in terms of pollutants being covered. In the protocol, it's, well, probably not so old in terms of instruments, but it's actually outdated with science. And I think that needs to catch up with the availability of data that is around there and that we can use. So, for instance, on the products side, because PRTR should also cover a tracking on what is the impact of products, so what they call diffuse sources. There's not so much out there in Europe, and actually it's outside of the European Union, I would say, that we have some meaningful PRTR reporting in the releases from products, which is, for example, the Norwegian or the Nordic PRTR, where they use emission factors on a group of products being used in that country, where they can show what is the impact of the use of those products. And we don't have that for the other PRTRs. Pesticides is a big topic as well. I mean, it's maybe basics, and well, if I can make some publicity for tomorrow for an event we will do from 10 to 12, there are a lot of shortcomings in terms of the outputs and the inputs on data being used for industrial activities. So on water consumption, energy consumption, resource footprint information in terms of the impact of the industrial processes, there's very little information being shared through the PRTR. I'm not saying it's not available, it's just not being shared in a meaningful way within the PRTR interfaces. For the chemicals specifically, you're probably familiar with the REACH regulation we have in Europe. So this one is also one where a lot of data is being generated about how we can get rid of the worst chemicals called substances of rare concern. I'm just saying it's the top of the chemical iceberg, if I can say, of the worst chemicals we would need to substitute. But there are, of course, many other hazardous substances in the chemical universe. But at least there, for the substance of rare concern, there are some tools which is actually called, right to know, Article 33, where you can know whether the substance are present or not in the articles. It's very limited information. We have a little database also there, the ZIP database, but for the moment it's a yes/no answer on what is in the products. We do not know who produced them, how much, and where they end up. And this is a big issue we have also in terms of what is the fate of the chemicals, where do they end up? So to make it short, I think it's all about better data integration and knowledge integration. That's one point. There's a lot of data out there, but it's not being integrated in a meaningful way. Possibly also because we had someone from the Basel and Rotterdam Convention. In relation to waste, there's a lot of information about hazard characterization in certain waste streams, which is not being used or integrated in these data portals. We cannot track, for example, where certain waste streams are going, or what type of waste we are talking about, and who is managing that waste. But it's actually data is there, but it's not being shared openly. There are many kind of right to know projects from citizens actually feeding into databases which have been generated, which I would like to highlight. I mean, for example, there's the Worldwide Air Quality Monitoring Data Index, aqecn.org, which has been actually, it's from universities, I think, who have collated all the monitoring data to bring it together at one place. So you have one interface where you can check what is the air quality, in different cities as we speak. And it predicts also the forecast of how air pollution levels could be. So it gives a tool for citizens like you and me, if you want to go out, go and have a run, if you should rather do it later in the day or maybe another day. So this is more about information sharing based on citizen science. There's also a Hack Air project I can mention from NGOs, which is about specifically air pollution in the cities. So where citizens with low-cost monitors are feeding data to the monitoring frameworks which are insufficient even in Europe. So if I may say a few kind of call for actions, or for the PRTR on what could be done. I mean, as I mentioned before, there's the best way to prevent the impact, or I would say right to know is good. It's good to know that you are being exposed. It's good to know where the danger comes from, but I think it would be even better to know what are we doing, what is industry doing, what are governments doing to prevent that impact to happen. So I would say our focus of data generation, knowledge sharing would be how to deal with pollution prevention at the sources, how to get rid of pollution, how to get rid of impacts, and how to track progress to get to like safe living conditions, good food, clean food, local food, climate compatible way of life, clean water, as you know. So what are the essentials? How are we dealing with the essentials? And I think there the product passport is very important. We are not there yet. I mentioned this before. There's a big gap on environmental footprint information for the products, the hazard ratings, the content. We can, I mean, Amazon, just to say that they know everything about you, about your behavior when you buy something. There's a lot of data IT tools which can understand a lot about how citizens act, how they behave. And we don't have that yet for the product passports. So it should be possible to know the footprints of certain activities. We just need to integrate the data and knowledge and centralize this and allow for a user-friendly access to this content. I will skip the things I mentioned before about the consumption aspects, which are missing. But I think what is also missing is transparency and accountability in decision-making when we decide on policy, so or standards. And there, I think also the special rapporteur has made several points about the bottlenecks linked to confidential business information or, for example, intellectual property rights, whereas in science or basic information is being labeled as confidential or not possible to share because of whatever. And I think there we should be very clear that whenever this information, data, science relates to policy making or standards making, relating to environmental impact, it should not be possible to hide that information. And then the good science or not good science, this is, I think, the tricky bit. So how to avoid a conflict of interest, for example, when we have authorizations going for certain chemicals, pesticides. There has been a lot of bad experience with pesticides approvals, but I think in the chemicals approvals scheme, we need to ensure that science, which do this risk assessment, is free from corporate interests. And how we can finance that is also an important point. And maybe here the polluter pays principle should come into play, that the ones who produce those toxic chemicals, hazardous chemicals, should pay a levy on the marketing of those substances, which could be used, for example, to fund independently scientists to assess the risks of those chemicals. Well, this is one of the general points. Maybe also one final point I would like to make is about the comparability of progress. And the PRTR should help to compare the tracking of progress and efforts on delivering on pollution prevention. And I think there, the current way on how the PRTR data is being presented is not user-friendly, because it doesn't say, for example, how is the hazard index per capita or in a certain country, how is the air pollution index? We can measure this against, for example, WHO guidelines. We have new target values there. I think we need this kind of meaningful index on where are we going to in terms of pollution prevention. And this is, I think, where it's very important on how to present the data. Not just how much is being presented, but how is it presented. And the format should be used to track progress. And I think this links very much to the SDG goals. There should be some key performance indicators on how we can track the progress. For example, hazard avoidance, pollution reduction, climate compatibility, etc., etc. So I think there's still a long way to go to make the PRTR as the right helpful tool to not only know more about what is the status of the environment currently, but also how we can track performance and benchmark all the actors involved. And I would say in particular, the companies putting onto the market or into the environment those chemicals, but also the decision makers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. And now has come the time of the discussion and also the reaction of various elements important that were provided by the various speakers. I want also to mention that we have Christophe Dussault from UNEC who has joined us, and Christophe is indeed in charge of the secretariat of the protocol. With that, I'm turning to Yves Lador, who will be animating the discussion and who will start by reacting to your interventions and also some of the comments that we have already received on the chat. Don't hesitate to use the chat to write your comments. Yves, over to you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So yes, well, thank you very much for all of the comments that were done on the panel. I just want to underline, especially what you just said, Christian, and the analysis that you have brought about the PRTR and what still needs to be done in order to improve. I think what is quite interesting in what we have just heard with the two discussions, the one is to come, but the one that we heard at the Human Rights Council with around the reports on the right to science, is precisely first to see, I would say, what is registered in the tool, in the PRTR, because indeed, as you underlined, science today is bringing more information, has a wider view, and there is a bit of a historical trap in which the PRTR are today due to the time when they've been conceived, probably also due to the fact that it takes time to do the formula, to do the practice. It is quite a strong but a heavy mechanism. So indeed, there is in a way a backlog that need to be catched up, and we see that when you do the comparison between what is required to be registered and the global science. And perhaps what we're lacking right now is a place or a forum where this can be discussed. And the issue that we are raising right now are pretty interesting in the perspective of the next meeting of the United Nations Environmental Assembly at the beginning of next year, because it is intended, and we know that Switzerland has the intention to propose the development of a science policy interface. Exactly that has been described by the special rapporteur. We have this on biodiversity, we have it on climate change, we don't have it for the chemicals. But then the report that has been produced and presented last month is a particularly important tool for the development of such a science-based and a science policy interface. Because a lot of the elements that are in this report are particularly relevant for the question of the independence of science in the field of toxics and chemicals generally. The science in the field of climate change was not that much, I would say, related to industry itself or to a corporation. It's not the fact, historically speaking, over the years. I mean, because climate science is a rather new science compared to the chemical science in general, that really brings us back to the 19th century. And over the time, of course, it has been entangled with a huge number of interests. And it's very important to try to have a real place where independent science can be discussed and can be brought together. And this is going to be quite a big challenge in the coming years for the development of this science policy interface. So I think this connection between the PRTR, between what is done by the Basel-Rotterdam Conventions and what is being discussed at the Human Rights Council in view of the coming efforts that are supposed to follow up after the United Nations Environmental Assembly. This is a link which is unfortunately not very often done and definitely needs to be reinforced. And actually, by saying that, it leads me to one of the comments we had in the chat, and I'd like really to thank its author about what is done in the field of aviation with ICAO and so on, the International Civil Aviation Organization. I'm sorry for the acronym. And I think these are very relevant comments and directly fall into this issue of how do we link the different debates. We have debates going on, but in a certain number of silos. And then we see that very often similar questions are raised in different places with a few difference, with a few nuance, but actually, basically speaking, they are the same questions. And then we don't have enough discussion to link all of them together. So indeed, ICAO, this International Civil Aviation Organization, has its own rules, its own way of proceeding, and I would say also its own lack of transparency, because there is really a big issue of transparency with ICAO. And what is interesting, unfortunately, the special rapporteur had to leave for another meeting, so it's great that he was able to stay with us for a full hour, but now he's not here. What would have been interesting is to hear the very first steps he has taken, because and you can see that on his webpage, on the webpage of his mandate, on the website of the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights. You can see that the special rapporteur has taken first steps for a visit to the International Civil Aviation Organization in order to discuss these issues. So we hope that there will be some follow-up on the question which are raised here in the chat, and we look forward to be able to continue this discussion because it's totally relevant. I don't know if Christian or Amélie and even Christophe, who was able to join us, would like to add or comment any of the elements before we get to a further question that might have been raised by the public. I don't know if Christian, Amélie, or Christophe, you would like to take the floor. I'll start with Christian because I probably listed too many people, so everybody's waiting for the others to answer first. Christian, I'll put you on the spot then.
Okay, Yves, thanks. I don't know if I need to put the video on, maybe you can put it off. Well, I think one important point which has been mentioned is the by the special rapporteur, where we need to get a common understanding is what is the right science, I mean the good science, right? So the best available science. And I think there, I think this is a critical point, is also what happens once we know, when we know the evidence, when the evidence is so clear, can we even afford to discuss longer on actions that need to be taken? And I think this is the critical point where the governance aspect comes into play, where we have elected government officials who take the decision at the end of the day. How does this decision fit to the science? And this is quite a debatable topic. But I mean, there's of course a duty for governments to take account the science. I mean, I hope. But then I think this is something where we as NGO at least would say there are certain aspects which are non-negotiable. The right for not being exposed, for example, to hazardous chemicals. The living conditions being affected, like climate science. I mean, this is non-negotiable, full stop. And then what are the actions to be taken that deliver and preserve the living conditions of this planet? I think there should be some effectiveness scaling on the efforts being made by the actors involved. And I think this was one point I mentioned before. There has been so many, the tobacco, I think, example was one, the asbestos is another one. Now we have PFAS and other alternative chemicals, where we actually know there's an issue, but the creation of doubt, the paralysis by analysis kind of thing is really used as an excuse, where I would say, come on, government officials, you know, you have to act, don't play this game, and act. And I think there, I don't know what can the PRTR do here? And I mentioned these KPIs, that we have a key performance indicators also for the decision makers or those involved in taking the decisions to protect us, that they need to report how the non-action or action they take will deliver on the desired outcomes. It's a very general point I make here, but I think getting this transparency and accountability is also important for increasing public trust. That we and also I think knowledge sharing on how to deal with solutions to a problem instead of putting the solution under the carpet, if I can say it, or talk around it all the time instead of taking actions to remediate the issue. Maybe it's out of what you wanted to hear, but I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting answer. And let me turn to Amélie, if ever you wanted also to add something, and I'll turn afterwards to Christophe Dussault from the Protocol Secretariat.
Thank you, Yves. Yes, I just wanted to stress upon the fact and the legal aspects that the BRS conventions, at the core of the BRS conventions, you have this science policy interface. It's really key for the work under these conventions. And I've mentioned the work that was done at a primary stage, technical and scientific work at the primary stage of the subsidiary bodies, in particular the Chemical Review Committee, under the Rotterdam Convention, the POPROC, which is the committee for the listing of chemicals under the Stockholm Convention. And although the experts that are sitting at this at the meetings of these bodies, they are appointed by governments, they have to sit in their technical capacity as experts, chemical experts. I didn't mention also an important work which is done, for example, also based on the science policy interface under the Stockholm Conventions. It's the production of the BEP, best available techniques, best environmental practices under the Stockholm Conventions. And you can see, if you look at the websites of the BRS conventions, there have been quite a few decisions by the Conference of the Parties, which is the governing body, on these science-based techniques and practice to better handle and manage in a more environmentally sound manner the chemicals that are covered under the Stockholm Convention. So these are the elements that I wanted to mention also, in addition to feed the discussion. Thank you, Yves.
Thank you very much, Amélie. And Christophe, thank you for joining us. I know it's a very busy time for you because you're just before next week with your own meeting of the parties. Thank you. It's really great to have you. Would you like to do any comments on what you've heard, or perhaps complement some of the elements that were shared in this discussion?
Thank you, Yves, and thank you, everybody. I'm sorry for not being able to join earlier. Yes, I'm not 100% sure I got right if there was a specific question, but in general, I understood it's about the link between PRTRs and the science policy interface. You want to, yes. So I would just like to add, I very much agree with what has been said by Christian and Malika before. But I would like to add maybe that what we saw in a recent survey on the experience from parties to the protocol, on their implementation of the protocol, and since the protocol gives a lot of room also on how you implement and what specific data you are requesting for reporting to the PRTR system, to the national systems, and then how that data is used by the government and by other stakeholders, etc. So we see that even if you have a harmonized legally binding instrument, you have a lot of different ways how to do things. And there's really a lot of room for sharing experience due to that. Different ways to implement the systems. And what I think is quite important to understand is that even, and also adding maybe to the current example of the COVID epidemic and pandemic, and how different reactions to scientific facts can be developed, right? And how these change over time, etc., and how these are linked with other issues that are equally important, etc. So I think the protocol on PRTRs and PRTRs in general, one of their advantages compared to other systems is really that you have this aspect of making information available to everybody in an easy way. with easy access, and that's really what the focus is on, and what is really useful, and what makes it possible to actually follow different steps in the decision-making process and get involved. You actually gain the capacity to get involved. On the other hand, it's also important, and that's what we see from parties that actually have very successful PRTR systems in place, that the public is aware of, that the government uses in many different ways. Those PRTRs really are PRTRs where there are groups of people, maybe scientists, but more often it's the government itself, but also in some cases the industry and of course the public, when they really have a direct use that is associated with the PRTR data, and when those who set the PRTR system up in the first place, they were able to understand properly what kind of data is needed for the different stakeholder groups. And when this communication is done in a good way, you are able to have successful PRTR systems that really play a role in not only making it easier to for governance issues, but also in being able to track and adapt different policy making decisions, where you I'm drifting off a little bit here, but there's so much stuff involved in this. But let me just finish by saying that one thing that we also saw with COVID now is that you get this information from the science, but then things change also over time. So you need to be able to adapt. And that's something that the PRTR gives you, that you track over time, and then you can adapt depending on the evidence you receive from the PRTR reporting. Let me just stop here.
Thank you very much. Well, I think Christian, sorry, wanted to react also to some of the comments. I'll give you briefly the floor, and afterwards we'll go to the final questions of this Q&A. So Christian, I think you wanted to react.
Just a quick reaction. I mean, yes, fully agree with what Malika and Christoph have said, and I think this is something which reminds me the BAT-BEP keyword. I mean, we have also something in Europe. I mean, when in looking at the activities of the PRTR, as they are the big industrial activities, we develop this EU best available technique reference documents, and I think there, yes, it's also a process where we have NGOs and industry and member states involved. However, when you really go into the what is BAT actually, what does it mean? What is the level? We do not have a forward-looking approach, let's call it like that. So this is what is the current kind of data showing and saying, and there it becomes more tricky when we define the best practice versus average practice. And I think this is what I meant also before with the KPIs, that if we set depollution index, for example, yeah, or decontamination objective or target as the benchmark to reach, then we can report and compare against this benchmark. And maybe for the POPs example, there are a lot of sites, industrial sites, for example, where the soil and groundwater monitoring data is not being shared or has not been yet tracked, and also like the cleanup, how has it been done? And I think this is something where the PRTRs, I mean, again, they're just a tool to an end, I would say, could help to share best practice, share also efforts and knowledge on what is happening around the globe. And I think this comparability is something very important, and where UNICEF and OECD and other partners are working very hard to make the data more integrated and more usable at the global phase, like a global level, let's say. So, and here I come from the EU perspective, where we have, many different languages, and as an end user, it's very useful if you want to compare different countries, that you have the information in a way that you can use it in a more effective way. Let's say you can download the data sets, electronic comparisons. You also put the data into the context, not just how much emission is going out or how much impact, but also what is this installation producing. you know, how much production output, how much energy or whatever is it delivering, and then you can put this into the context. So I think this is something. Yes, it's very free, the PRTR, on how it should be developed, but this is a bit of a drawback. It has been too free, and I think this is why the full potential of those systems are not being made use of. But we're working to that, I think, to improve it.
Okay, so that's the target for the next cycle after the meeting of the parties, I guess. So, well, thank you very much for all of these different comments. There was a very interesting question that I propose to take as a conclusion that was raised also in the chat, and saying, you know, why are in this field do we all so often have the impression that we're still working with an old mindset, like if the things have not evolved? And to some extent, I really share this impression because when you have to deal with, for example, climate change issues, or you deal with, so when you're dealing with these different sectors, the way things are organized, it's not just a science, because the science is going its own way, but when you don't have this interface, you do have this big gap in a way, and you feel the difference between approach, because we had the same thing with COVID. It was great, Christophe, that you raised this issue, because indeed there's a lot also to learn in our field from what has happened during COVID and the way that the scientific issues were managed. We see that you have an old approach really based on expertise. And that's probably what is reflected by the BAT and all these you know, best available technologies and these type of approaches. And the one that has been developed more recently, which now is labeled as a science policy interface. I'm not sure it's the most the best wording, but that's the way at least it's used at the international. And we see that there's a big difference there. And I was wondering if ever you had any views on your side, and I propose we do a last round of very short comments, ending comments, a final word. And Amélie, would you like to be the first one to start with a final comment on that?
Yes. Comment about the opportunity to seize.
Yes.
Yeah, COVID time has been a very challenging time for all of us, but also a carrier of a lot of opportunities of raising consciousness. There's an important work also being done on plastic under the PRS convention. And although COVID has delayed a lot of actions and activities, even our COPS meetings, it's also an opportunity to even better come equipped and think more. Because as I mentioned earlier, the COP meetings that were supposed to take place this year only had an online segment on the issues, on mostly financial budget issues, but gave more time on more substantive one, and the one among others, the ones that I discussed today, for parties and other stakeholders. And a great example is the partnerships that exist now in plastic to continue the shift, because I don't agree that there's still old ways. I think that from disturbances and imbalances, and especially the highly unusual one that we've gone through this pandemic, there are a huge amount of opportunities to seize. And as far as the PRS conventions are concerned, aligned with UNEA 5, Human Rights Council, UN General Assembly, there's really a lot of occasions for parties and other stakeholders to act as one. And it's not just the UN who should act as one. It's also, as I mentioned earlier, the 360-degree vision and partnerships, public-private partnership at all levels, national, regional, and global, do have an immense opportunity to actually act better, build back better, as we've heard a lot over the past couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amélie. So I guess it's a good challenge from the BRS to the coming MOP next week. You know? Take up the opportunities and raise up to the level that of the challenge that we have to face now, especially after COVID. Christian, what's your take on that?
Ooh, tricky. I mean, old mindset. Maybe also just looking at the PRTR, I mean, when it was adopted, I think so many things have happened. And I think thanks to COVID, I mean, you know, how to engage with people, like from remote, digital, well, we call it the digital age, you know, like there's a lot of satellite monitoring data, you know, product benchmarking data sets. The computers are much more powerful. So if I can say like, okay, now we have also maybe a friend we can use, which is the artificial intelligence and digitalization agenda, which can also work for us. So, for example, what I mean here is work for the enforcers. You do the right reporting through electronic means, not paperwork. You can get the data much faster how you want it, and process much faster the information in a way that will facilitate your day-to-day work. So I think that is something to learn and I think catch up with. Like there's so much tools out there we could use to work for us, which can really facilitate the benchmarking, compliance promotion, identification of progress and hotspots, integration of satellite, remote monitoring, etc., etc. And I think we are far from taking that tools for the benchmarking under the PRTR. If I can say that is maybe something I can just from top of my head, which links maybe to the mindset of the past where we were still considering, oh, this will all be paper reporting stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much, and Christian, for this, and quite a challenge indeed. You're continuing on the same line as what Amelie had said before. Just to underline that it's true that in the field of the chemicals, we're talking about tens of thousands of substances, and very often we forget that. Only a very few are regulated, but when we want to look at the whole thing, it's just so massive that indeed you definitely have a point that will be quite interesting to look into the future. Christophe, I'm turning to you. I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm turning to you for a final word from the Secretariat of the protocol. Perhaps precisely, do you think that at the next MOP we are going to do some steps forward and leave this old mindset that sometimes some of us are talking about? I'm afraid you're mute. Christophe, I'm afraid we don't hear you.
Oh, now you can hear me, right? You can hear me now? Okay. Yes. Yeah, yes and no. It definitely takes a long time for a legally binding instrument to get up to date, and it will never be in the first line with regards to being up to date, because it's about everybody agreeing, and that takes time. But it's also something that provides a lot of opportunity for development of our systems and of our mindsets, not least. And the protocol requires parties to provide easy access to this the data on pollutant releases and transfers, and that's really the core of it, and that's really what gives everybody the opportunity to be a part of the development of a PRTR. However, this is in practice very difficult for a lot of people to be involved in these kind of issues, because it's perceived as something to be very complex. But there is this obligation to provide easy access, and there's this the sense of providing data that is useful for different groups of stakeholders. And so it's for everybody. Also, I invite everybody to talk to people that are involved in PRTRs and let them know what kind of information you need. And then there can be a discussion. Okay, can PRTRs actually provide that information? Does it make sense to include this kind of information to the PRTR system, etc.? So it's all about communicating and sharing what you know and what you want to know also. not only if you have information, but also to share what kind of information might be useful for you to do your work better.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And indeed, you're underlying a point which is so important concerning this instrument of PRTR. They're a meeting place, they're a meeting point where precisely not only scientists or technicians can be involved, and we know that you have the chemical scientists, but you also have all the electronic engineering, the software engineering, precisely to make things easy and user-friendly, which makes it also, it's supposed to be also a meeting place where you can also meet the public. So let's look forward for next week. That's going to be a challenge for the end of next week, for the fourth meeting of the parties, so that this event will be a meeting place for the public, for the NGOs, for the specialists, and for the decision makers. So we really look forward for that. And in this perspective, as it was said, there will be also an important event soon that was announced by Christian, and you can find it on the chat. So this is part of the different side events which are preparing next week's event. And so, Christian, I think it's for tomorrow at 10, right? So that we can have more discussion on precisely on the aspects of the pesticides. So this will continue. And there's also other interesting events to be announced. So I'd like for this to thank really warmly and turn the floor to our host, the Geneva Environmental Network, who has made this event possible. Diana, back to you.
Actually, Yves, I was going to thank you because Yves from Urgis proposed to have this thematic session that was very informative. So with that, we would like, of course, to thank all of you, the speakers that joined us today, but also the attendees, and who has worked behind the scenes to make this event possible. And as Yves mentioned, tomorrow, today, they are after our event, there are still side events to both the Aarhus Convention MOP and the PRTRs MOP. And tomorrow also a few more events. Among those, one that we are co-hosting again with Urgis, which is about welcoming Guinea-Bissau to the Aarhus Convention. And this new dimension it offers for the convention. It's tomorrow at 1 p.m. again, and we hope to see you all again with us. And with that, I think we can now close the session and thank once more all of you. And here you have a few more images of what's next in Geneva, events we are hosting or co-hosting at the Geneva Environment Network. But of course, on our website, you will find much more information on the events that the over 100 institutions that are part of the Geneva Environment Network are organizing in Geneva or virtually. And also to mention that I think I forgot to mention at the beginning that the summary of this event, the video, as well as the links that have been presented, will be available on the webpage of this event that you can also see here. You have the shortcut at the bottom of this slide, but it has also been shared on the chat. So there we can continue the conversation. The video will be will continue to be visible, and all the documents that were mentioned and referred to will be also you will find there the links to. With that, I think it's now time to close. Good afternoon, good evening, or continuation of a good morning to all of you.
Very much. Bye.